Growing up, I heard countless stories from my father about life in Cuba, and they instilled in me from a very young age the desire to fight for change, to fight for truth, to fight for freedom. The yearning for liberty and the courage to fight for it is universal and deeply felt in every Cuban heart.
In a chamber built for power and persuasion, one voice rises for something greater. Not for politics, not for headlines, but for a man whose courage outlived his life. Oswaldo Payá, the Cuban dissident who defied a regime, armed only with faith and conviction. He was harassed, he was imprisoned, and when they silenced him, his message spoke louder than ever. Now, years later, his name returns, not whispered in the shadows of Havana, but spoken boldly on the floor of the United States Senate. A street, a name, a symbol that truth can never be buried, because sometimes remembrance itself is resistance.
Mr. President.
Senator from Texas.
Mr. President, I rise today to speak about Oswaldo Payá and, as I've done before, to urge this body to honor his legacy. Payá was a Cuban dissident who fought against the communist regime and who stood up and fought for free speech, for democracy, and for human rights. He was a thorn in the side of the Cuban communist regime his entire life. Oswaldo Payá was the only person at his school who refused to join the communist youth. Later, at the age of 35, he founded the Christian Liberation Movement, which called for nonviolent disobedience against the rule of the Cuban Communist Party. He then founded the Varela Project, which sought a referendum on Cuba's communist system. Throughout, he fought for democratic governance, religious liberty, freedom of expression, and the freedom to start businesses. For over 3 decades, Payá put pressure on the communist regime to free its political prisoners, to allow for genuine elections, and to uphold basic human rights. In retaliation, the regime harassed him. They arrested him repeatedly. And ultimately, in 2012, they killed him. But in life and in death, they never succeeded in silencing his message. Growing up, I heard countless stories from my father about life in Cuba, and they instilled in me from a very young age the desire to fight for change, to fight for truth, to fight for freedom. The yearning for liberty and the courage to fight for it is universal and deeply felt in every Cuban heart. Mr. President, since 2015, in every Congress, I have introduced legislation to rename the street outside the Cuban embassy Oswaldo Payá Way. This body has passed it before, rightly, unanimously. Oswaldo's legacy matters deeply to Cuba and to the United States. And it matters to his family, with whom I have worked closely on this resolution. Over the years, I've met many times with his daughter, Rosa Maria Payá. And Rosa Maria is herself a formidable and courageous dissident and warrior for human rights. Renaming the street in front of the Cuban embassy would help preserve that legacy. During the Cold War, President Reagan renamed the street in front of the Soviet embassy Sakharov Plaza, after the famed human rights dissident in the Soviet Union. It was part of a broader strategy to shine a light on the abuses of the evil empire. My strategy here is the same. Some might think a street name is not that big a deal. Well, it is. Anyone who wants to write to the Cuban embassy will have to write Oswaldo Payá's name. Anyone who wants to go there has to look up the address and see his name. The operatives of the Cuban regime will have to say or write his name. Saying his name has power. In just a moment, I will propound a unanimous consent request to take up and pass the Oswaldo Payá Way resolution. And I want to point out this is bipartisan legislation. Indeed, I am joined by Senator Durbin, the Democrat whip, in this legislation. In a previous Senate, this passed the Senate 100-0. That means every Republican voted for it and every Democrat voted for it. I am hopeful this Congress can demonstrate the same unity and the same resolve to stand up in support of democracy and in support of human rights. Right now, we will find out if that's the case. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent that the Committee on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs be discharged from further consideration of S-218 and the Senate proceed to its immediate consideration. I further ask that the bill be considered read a third time and passed, and that the motion to reconsider be considered made and laid upon the table.
Is there an objection?
Mr. President,
Senator from New Jersey.
reserving the right to object.
In the chamber where power speaks through measured words and polished gestures, a single voice rose, not for politics, not for fame, but for remembrance. A senator stood to speak a name the Cuban regime once tried to erase, a name that continues to echo across oceans and generations. Oswaldo Payá, a man whose courage defied silence, whose conviction outlived fear. He was not a soldier or a ruler. He was an ordinary man who believed that faith and freedom could exist side by side, even in a land where truth was forbidden. When he founded the Christian liberation movement, his weapon was not violence, but conscience. He called for nonviolent resistance, for dignity, for the right of every Cuban to speak and believe without fear. Through the Varela Project, he asked for what should be simple: a vote, a choice, a voice. But in a system built on control, even the smallest act of freedom was seen as rebellion. For decades, Oswaldo Payá challenged the Cuban regime's iron grip. He called for elections, for faith without persecution, for basic human rights. In return, he was arrested, harassed, and followed. And in 2012, his life ended under suspicious circumstances on a lonely road. The official story called it an accident, but many believed otherwise. His death was meant to silence him, but his message only grew louder, because the truth cannot be buried forever. Years later, inside the United States Senate, his name was spoken again. A senator from Texas rose to honor Paya's legacy, not with speeches about policy, but with a symbolic act: to rename the street outside the Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. as Oswaldo Payá Way. To some, it was just a signpost, but for those who understand the language of courage, it meant much more. Every letter sent to that embassy, every visitor searching that address would have to say his name. It was a quiet but powerful reminder that freedom remembers its heroes. This idea was not new. During the Cold War, the United States renamed the street outside the Soviet embassy after the dissident Andrei Sakharov. It was a statement that no regime, no matter how powerful, could escape the light of truth. Today, the same spirit returns. Renaming that street after Oswaldo Payá is not a political gesture, it's a moral one. It says that tyranny may erase lives, but not legacies. It says that freedom has a memory. Paya's story carries a message that reaches far beyond Cuba. Around the world, people still live under systems that punish thought, silence dissent, and fear faith. His life reminds us that real change rarely begins in comfort. It begins with someone willing to stand alone and speak when silence is safer. His daughter, Rosa Maria Paya, continues that mission today, carrying forward her father's dream of a free Cuba where truth can be spoken without fear. Symbols matter. They shape how nations remember, how generations understand their past. Naming a street will not topple a dictatorship, but it will ensure that every time the Cuban government sends mail, every time someone types that address, they must face the name of a man who refused to surrender. That is the power of remembrance, subtle, persistent, undeniable. Paya once said that freedom is built, not given, and that is what his legacy teaches, that courage can be quiet, that resistance can wear a smile, and that even one person's faith can shake the foundations of oppression. His life reminds us that freedom's flame doesn't die in darkness, it burns brighter because of it. Oswaldo Payá's name now stands not only for one man's struggle, but for the enduring belief that conscience cannot be killed. From Havana's backstreets to the steps of the U.S. Capitol, his legacy whispers a truth that every nation should remember. You can silence a voice, but not the truth behind it. And as that name is etched into a Washington street sign, it becomes more than a memorial. It becomes a message. To the people of Cuba, it says the world has not forgotten. To every person who dares to hope for freedom, it says your courage matters. And to every ruler who fears the truth, it says the truth always finds a way to speak. Because some names are not just written on walls or signs, they're written on the conscience of humanity itself. And Oswaldo Payá's name will remain there, unbroken, unforgotten, unafraid. In the end, it isn't the monuments or the laws that define a legacy. It's the courage to stand when silence is easier. Oswaldo Payá's life reminds us that truth has a pulse and freedom has a price. His voice may have been silenced, but his name now lives where power once tried to ignore it. And as long as that name stands, hope still breathes. So wherever you are, never underestimate the power of a single voice, because one act of courage can echo for generations. If this story moved you, don't let it fade. Share it, speak it, keep it alive. Truth deserves to be heard.